So, what if the best way to follow our ancestors was to actually not follow them blindly? Today, we're diving into a really powerful idea from Dr. Hani over at the Marvelous Quran channel. It's one that kind of re-examines centuries of tradition by focusing on a single game-changing concept: the ability to change. Okay, so let's get right into it. This is the question Dr. Hani gets more than any other, and you can see why, right? It's a heavy question, it challenges you on the spot, getting right to the heart of this huge debate about authority, tradition, and truth. So, how does he even begin to answer it? Well, to get his response, we first have to understand the one concept at the very center of that question. You see, at the core of that 1400-year question is this term, the Salaf, or the Pious Predecessors. It's a phrase that carries an immense amount of weight in Islamic thought. So before we go any further, let's break down exactly what it means. So who are the Salaf? The full term is as-Salaf, as-Salih, and it refers to the first three generations of Muslims. You've got the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, then their direct followers, and then the followers of those followers. The traditional view holds them up as the absolute gold standard, the purest, most authentic source for understanding the faith after the Quran. And this isn't just, a nice historical idea. It's a belief that proponents say is rooted directly in the Quran. The argument is that the Quran itself gives a special, guaranteed status to these early generations, which makes their understanding the benchmark for everyone who comes later. And here it is. This is the key verse from Surah 9, verse 100, that's always presented as the primary evidence. It talks about the first forerunners and those who followed them, and it says that Allah is pleased with them. For a lot of people, this verse basically settles the debate. Case closed, right? Their authority is divinely endorsed. Well, this is where Dr. Hani throws in a major plot twist. He points out that if you just keep reading, literally, to the very next verse, 101, the Quran paints a picture of that first community that is, well, it's far from perfect. Verse 101 says that right there, living among the first community, were hypocrites. And get this, even the Prophet himself didn't know who they were. This is huge. It shows that the first generation wasn't some monolith of perfect believers. And this observation leads him to identify two major fallacies in the traditional argument. So the first fallacy he talks about is what you could call the myth of the perfect past. This idea we have of a golden age where everyone was a living saint and they all lived in perfect harmony. And this slide really shows the contrast. On the one hand, you have this popular myth of perfection and unity. But Dr. Hani argues that the historical records, and we're talking about records from within the Islamic tradition itself, tell a story of intense, messy, and often violent human conflict. And the evidence is just staggering. I mean, right after the Prophet's death, you had the Ridda Wars. Then, the third caliph was assassinated by other Muslims. And then these devastating civil wars like Siffin and the Camel, where tens of thousands of early Muslims and companions killed each other. Dr. Hani's point here is simple. These were fallible human beings, not flawless saints. They were real people dealing with incredible turmoil. Now, this brings us to the second big fallacy he points out. Let's say, just for the sake of argument, that the early generations did have perfect knowledge. Dr. Hani asks a really practical question. How can we be so sure that all of that knowledge was perfectly preserved and transmitted all the way to us today? The common assumption is that we basically have a complete, flawless record of everything they thought and said. But the historical reality is filled with some pretty significant gaps. Just think about some of the evidence he brings up. We have exactly 0 preserved Friday sermons from the Prophet. 0. We don't have the original manuscripts for the foundational books of Hadith like Bukhari and Muslim. We have key narrators on record admitting that they actually hid some of the knowledge they had. And maybe the most shocking thing of all, the first 2 caliphs actively chose not to officially collect the Prophet's sayings. This timeline really puts it all into perspective. Just look at these gaps. The first official order to collect hadith didn't even happen until almost a century after the Prophet's death. Al-Bukhari, who is an absolute cornerstone of the tradition, lived nearly 240 years later, and Al-Tabari, who wrote the first complete Quranic commentary, almost 300 years later. For Dr. Hani, these centuries represent a massive question mark over the idea of a perfectly preserved record. So, if blindly following a record that might be flawed and is definitely incomplete isn't the answer, then what is? Well, this is where Dr. Hani proposes an alternative, a different methodology that he argues comes directly from the Quran itself. His entire approach really boils down to this one powerful idea. The Quran is a completely unique text, and because of that, it demands its own unique method for understanding it, a method found within its own pages, not forced on it from the outside. So the methodology he lays out is a really clear three-step process. Step 1, you start with the Quran as the primary #1 authority, period. Step 2, you use the Quran to interpret itself, paying close attention to its own internal logic and how it uses language. And only then, step 3, do you use that solid Quranic framework as the ultimate scale to measure everything else, all the traditions, commentaries, and opinions that came later. And this brings us to what is really the climax of his entire argument, a surprising, powerful paradox that he says is the single most important lesson we can learn from the pious predecessors themselves. So what is this incredible lesson? It's a total paradox. Dr. Hani argues that the greatest legacy of the Salaf is that they themselves were defined by their rejection of blindly following their own predecessors. I mean, just stop and think about that for a second. The first companions, the very heart and soul of the Salaf, what did they do? They were the ones who broke with the traditions, the culture, and the religion of their own parents and their own society. Their legacy wasn't imitation. It was the incredible courage to critically look at the past and embrace a totally new way of life based on revelation. So to truly follow their way, he argues, isn't to imitate blindly. It's to embrace that same spirit of critical thinking. And that leaves us with a final and pretty powerful question to think about. If the true way of the Salaf was actually their amazing capacity for change and their courage to question the past, what does that mean for us today? What is our legacy meant to be?